1 Corinthians chapter 9. So try to get all our things ready and remember where we were. We're right at the end here. I think we have one more verse in chapter 9. We're going to back up and get a few verses just to get our context. But before we begin this morning, let's begin with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for the day that you have given us, for the blessings of life, for the health that we have such that it is. We're thankful for this hour of study that we have set aside to study your word. May much good come from it. We pray for all of those during this hour who are endeavoring to search your word. Pray that you would bless us in all that we do for you. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, it's been a couple of weeks since we've been together. Appreciate Randy and his teaching last week. You know, it's one of the more difficult things, at least this side of a pulpit, to fill in for someone who's teaching, because if you have just 1 hour, what are you going to teach on? If you go too far, you have too much that you want to cover, that's it. You don't have any more time after that. And so I appreciate his filling in, his ability, and all of those who fill in when I'm unable to be here. I'm glad for his participation in leading our study last week. We're going to be in chapter 9 this week, just to remember where we were, to remind ourselves where we were from a couple of weeks ago. We're here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Paul has been defending some of his actions, especially, or I guess it would be his inaction in asking them for support. And the enemies of Paul and enemies of the church had many things to say about that, and Paul was taking this opportunity to tell them not only why he could have asked them, or why he should have perhaps asked them for support financially. He also was defending his reason for not doing that. And so we'll begin here in verse 23 to get our context up to the end of this chapter, because he makes an important point that we want to point out before we go on to chapter 10. So here, beginning in verse 23, I do all things, Paul says, for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Verse 25, 26, everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They do it to obtain a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable one. Therefore I run in such a way as not to run aimlessly. I box in such a way as to avoid hitting the air. Of course, this is the New American Standard Version, a little bit different perhaps than the one that you have. However, we need to understand what Paul is mentioning here all the way through verse 27. Let's get to one final verse there. But I strictly discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. The King James says, I myself will become a castaway. Paul begins there in verse 23, going through verse 27, by telling them the reason that he did all that he did. Remember, this whole chapter has been about his defense, why he did certain things. And so we assume, and I believe rightly so, that Paul they were saying about Paul that he was either in it for the money, or that he had some nefarious means for what he was doing. His reason for preaching, his reason for taking the money that they gave him to the church at Jerusalem, whatever his motivations were, they were ill-gotten. And so Paul was having to defend his motivation here. And he told them, I came to you and I didn't want you to support me at all. I didn't want anything to stand between you and the gospel, including the financial burden that I could have been on you. Now we've already noticed, I think it was 7 reasons why he could have. And in the 2 Corinthian letter, he's going to apologize to them for not asking them for support, because he realizes it turned out to be the wrong decision. But here beginning in verse 23, he tells them, this is the reason why I do everything. It's the reason I get up in the morning. It's the reason I came to Corinth. It's the reason that I didn't ask for support. And it's the reason why in other places I did require them to support me financially. He said, I do all things for the gospel's sake, that I might be a joint partaker of it. Then beginning in verse 24 and going through 26, as we noticed the last time that we were together, Paul uses an illustration that was apt for the church here at Corinth. He uses something that they understood in their everyday life, or that was familiar to them in their culture, and he applies a spiritual lesson to it. This is very similar to the reason Jesus used the illustrations he did in his parables. There's a reason that Jesus didn't use this illustration to his audience, because they were more familiar with fishing and with farming than they were with athletic games. These here in Corinth, if you use some kind of illustration having to do with fishing or with agriculture, it wouldn't have been the same to them, because it was not something that they were familiar with or that they did on a regular basis. These here in Corinth were familiar with these athletic competitions, and that's what he begins there in verse 24. Those that run that race, all of them run, but only one receives that prize, that perishable wreath. And then he connects the illustration there. We run so that we can have that imperishable one, or that permanent wreath, that permanent goal that we are striving for. But then he turns inwardly, verse 26, and he says, I therefore run, not uncertainly, not as someone who is unaware of what he is doing. Paul lived and did everything on purpose. Whenever he made a decision, he tried to make the best one that he could. So when he came here and told them, I don't want you to support me at all, I'm going to support myself, and I want you to concentrate on being Christians and on obeying the gospel and all of this. When he made that decision, he was doing it to the best of his ability, which again tells me that Paul wasn't always inspired whenever he was walking around, or from the moment he woke up till the moment he went to sleep. He wasn't speaking for God all of those times. He made mistakes. He made wrong decisions. He told the church at Rome, I'm going to come to you on my way to Spain. He didn't know the future. He wasn't always inspired. He was when he wrote this letter, when he spoke in public, and when he was clearly inspired. But there were times when he wasn't. This perhaps was one of those when he came here to the church and told them, I don't want you to support me, because it turns out that was the wrong decision. But he says, I do everything. I run not uncertainly. I fight as one who is not beating the air or boxing the air. Think of someone who is training. Perhaps if you've ever, perhaps you've seen highlights of someone who is preparing for a boxing match. If you ever, usually they'll show people who are boxing either a really large bag or the speed bag that's on there. And all they're doing, they're not punching anyone. They're basically punching air. There's nothing there but that bag that they're practicing on. And so Paul says, I'm not someone who's just boxing there. I'm actually in the ring. I'm actually there fighting. That's what I'm living life, and I'm doing it on purpose, and I'm actually out there fighting. And so these enemies that have these things to say against him, Paul would probably say that they were the ones who were boxing the air. They're just, they're talking amongst themselves. They're not actually doing any work. They're not actually doing what is needed to be done. I'm the one who's doing and preaching the gospel. I'm the one who's doing those things. So I run not as uncertainly. I fight not as one who's boxing the air. And then verse 27, time that we have here this morning. But I strictly discipline my body. Again, continuing with that illustration of one who is in these games. The Corinthians would have been familiar with that, having their own Olympic-style games that they had here in town. I discipline. I think the King James says, I buffet my body. I beat it into submission. New American Standard translates it as, I make it my slave. I make my body my servant, which is an interesting idea there, because there is a possibility that after I have preached to others, I myself would be disqualified. I like the New American Standard translation there because it continues that illustration. A castaway, certainly. But disqualified as being someone who misses the mark or starts the race early or commits a foul and is disqualified from the race that he's been training for and is currently engaged in. Paul said, I myself, I discipline my body. Why? Why is that important for him to discipline? Notice he says, I beat my body into submission. My body is now my slave. Notice that there seems to be a disconnect here between my body and me. It's almost like there's something separate from my body, which would be the soul there. James says the body without the soul is dead, not the soul without the body. The body, once it's separated from me, the soul, the body's gone, it's dead. And so Paul said, I discipline my body and I make it my slave. Why is that? If it were true that once I was saved, I was always saved, then why would it matter what I do with my body? He's talking to a group of people who were using, some of them were using their body in immoral ways to commit sin. Paul said, I discipline my body. I make sure that I, like that runner, like that boxer, like that Olympic medalist, disciplines himself to make his body do what it needs to do when the moment counts. But instead of winning some kind of wreath that's going to fade away in a few days, he's striving for that crown that never is going to fade away. Why is it that he disciplined his body? Romans 6 verse 12 is an important verse, I think, for this idea here. Let's go there. Notice Romans 6 and verse 12. Because it does away with this notion, of course, a number of verses do, but it does away with this idea or this notion that what I do in my body doesn't affect my soul. Notice Paul said in Romans 6 and verse 12, let not sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it and the lusts thereof. Contrary to this idea that once I'm saved, I'm always saved, Paul said that once I begin that race, if I'm not careful, I can disqualify myself. He's going to say at the end of verse 27. But he also says that we need to condition our bodies so that it will obey what we know we ought to do. That's because what I do in my body affects my soul. Before I become a Christian, and Paul speaking here after he became one. My body affects my soul. What I do, and that might be something that we don't really think about or question, but there were tendencies at the time, there were ideologies that were forming at the time that would get to the point where people would say, well, what you do with your outer body, your outer self, doesn't affect the inward person, the soul there. So the outward person is different from the inward. The outward person might make bad decisions and do immoral things, but it doesn't affect that soul that's saved. And that has come to us today in the idea of once saved, always saved. Once you believe, whatever it is, then you are saved, and there's nothing you can do after that point to be lost. Paul would not understand that concept, and he certainly wouldn't agree with it, because he says, I, an apostle, an inspired speaker for Jesus himself, told people that he disciplined his body so that it would obey him. And then he said, lest or just in case, after I've preached to others, after I've told other people what they need to do, I myself might be disqualified or be a castaway. Meaning he's no longer in that race. He was running for that prize, and now he's no longer in the race. Why? Because he's disqualified himself by living in sin. If Paul could be disqualified, if Paul could be a castaway, if Paul could lose his salvation, how do we think that we can't? Now, don't misunderstand. The other side of that coin is the idea that some would present that says, well, if you think that you can lose your salvation, then you're living in constant fear. One of the, I hate to use the word comforting, but one of the comforting concepts when it comes to once saved, always saved, is the idea that once I'm saved, I can sit back in comfort and not worry about losing my salvation. People cling to that because they say, I'm there, I'm safe in the arms of Jesus. No one can snatch me out of his hand. And so they would look at what we're teaching, that once you're saved, you can lose your salvation. They would say, well, you're living in fear all the time because you're living in fear of one moment you're saved and the next minute you're not. And that's not what the Bible teaches. And that's not what's true. Because once I'm saved, I am always saved as long as I remain in Jesus. But when I decide to sin, when I decide to live in sin, when I decide to leave him, then I've decided to give up my salvation. And so sure, once I'm saved, I'm always saved as long as, there has to be a qualifying statement, as long as I remain in Jesus. Paul said, I discipline my body so that I'm not afraid. I discipline my body so that I'm not afraid that I'm going to lose it, because after I've preached to others, I can be a castaway if I don't discipline my body, if I don't pay attention, if I don't walk circumspectly, as he told those in the book of Ephesians. So this verse and many others, there are just so many that we could notice that tell his readers and tell us that once we're saved, we're not always saved. We shouldn't look at it as something that's guaranteed. Oh, it is guaranteed, and it's safe in his hands, but we have the choice to leave it. This is not a mistake. This is not something, a momentary lapse of judgment. This is something that I am, if I have habitually left him. We do sin. John said, if any man says he has not sinned, he's a liar. We do sin. The blood of Christ continually cleanses us from sin. But if I decide to leave because I haven't disciplined my body, my mind, to make it my servant, then I can wander off. I can make the decision to do that, or I can, by constantly having those lapses in judgment, simply find myself wandered away. But the choice ultimately is mine. And so Paul tells them, I do all these things so that I might be joint partakers with you, but I run this race on purpose, and I do it with carefulness so that I will not disqualify myself. After I've preached to others, I myself could be a castaway or disqualified. Again, if the Apostle Paul could be disqualified, well, then I certainly can be as well. And that's not to make us live in fear, but to get us to understand and live on purpose the way that Paul did. We discipline our bodies by studying. We discipline our bodies by meeting together. That's one of the reasons why we should meet together, because it's not necessarily sparring practice, but we're practicing together. We're here together and encouraging one another. That helps us to discipline our body, if we're using Paul's phrase there. That's a lot that I said, but anything there, the last part of chapter 9, especially verse 27, once saved, always saved. Again, I don't know that it was set up like this, but it works out very nicely that Matthew through John tell us about the gospel and why we need to be saved and how we can be. The book of Acts tells us what to do in order to be saved, including immersion, baptism for the remission of sins. And then the book of Romans through Jude tell us why we need to stay saved. They're all written to Christians to try to tell them how to remain faithful because of one reason or another. And if we can't lose our salvation, to me, book of Romans through the book of Jude is really unnecessary, and God wasted the time of a lot of people. And then the book of Revelation is there to tell us about what happens because we're saved in the end. And so those books in the middle don't make any sense or useless, really, if we can't lose our salvation. We can wander off, and so we certainly need to be careful for that. All right, let's look at chapter. Yes, sir, go ahead before we finish. Oh, Calvin, sure. Sure.
When did that become popular?
I got you. Yeah, I briefly mentioned it, and it was probably a little convoluted when I said it. Brother Marvin wants us to look at the idea of John Calvin, Martin Luther, some of these other things. The idea of once saved, always saved goes back a lot further than that. Calvin and Luther and some of these others in the 14th and 15th, 16th centuries goes back further than that. There's this idea of, it's called Gnosticism, Gnostic, Gnostic. It comes from the idea of knowledge. Not long after the first century, into the second century, it's not really a core belief, but it's a number of ideologies that we kind of lump together to call Gnosticism. But they brought in the ideas of Christianity, Judaism, and paganism, and kind of swirled it all in a pot. And it was a constant temptation for God's people during this time period. But they took various ideologies from the surrounding world, including Greek philosophy. And Gnosticism, from what we can tell, taught that the immortal soul that you have is different from the physical body that you have. Actually, they taught that the God of the Old Testament was actually Satan, and that Satan of the Old Testament was actually God. And that God created this perfect soul, and then Satan came along and wrapped it in a physical body. And the physical body is evil. Anything that you can touch is evil, according to Greek philosophy. And so Christianity, God came in the New Testament to try to show us how to save that immortal soul that was trapped in this evil flesh. And our job now is to get the soul that's perfect and saved separate from that physical body. And there are two ways to do that. One is you give the flesh all that it wants. It wants to sin, so you sin as much as you can. You give it all the drink and all the everything else that you can, and basically drown it. And then that spirit will be released. And the other way is to remove, don't ever give it anything that it ever wants. It's called the ascetics. People who would just punish them. They'd whip themselves and all this other stuff, trying to get that physical body. They would use verses like this, I discipline my body, to the idea that that's how you separate that spirit from the flesh. But the idea developed that this evil flesh is separate from your spirit. And what I do with this evil flesh does not affect this perfect soul. And that developed over the centuries of theological teaching to the ideas of John Calvin. Calvinism is kind of what we call it today. Martin Luther and others during the Protestant Reformation. John Calvin taught among his many tenets the perseverance of the soul, or of the saints, that once you're saved, you're always saved. It wasn't a new idea at that time, but he kind of packaged it in a way that people could take it with them. That once you're saved, once you are a saint, you're going to persevere. You're not going to be able to be lost. That number is fixed of who is saved and who is lost. And so John Calvin really packaged that nicely for us in his writings. To many have it today, and it exists in just about every denominational group in one way or another. And from those Gnostic teachings early on, there are many other teachings that we have today that we don't have time to go into. But yes, John Calvin, Calvinism is the teaching today, and part of that is once you're saved, you're always saved. And so it came from a very early on idea, and it develops, as most ideas do, into what we have today. Anything else that you want to add or ask about that? All right, let's go to chapter 10. Speaking about, now Paul, again, these chapters and these verses were not inspired, the numbers, and so we shouldn't end chapter 9 and think that's it. All right, let's go to a new chapter. These all were together as one letter. So he talks about verse 27 of chapter 9, lest by some means I myself could be disqualified. And now he's going into chapter 10, which we call it chapter 10, and he's going to talk about the idea of apostasy. We're going to call this chapter Apostasy and Ideology. Now, idolatry. Apostasy, it kind of looks like apostle, but that has nothing to do with that. The word apostasy means to leave or to abandon. This is someone who is a Christian and has now gone back into the world, given up their salvation. That is apostasy. And so this idea of leaving Christ, going back into the world because of such things such as idolatry. These are the two ideas that he's going to talk about here in chapter 10. Certainly a great chapter here on not only the idea that we can lose our salvation. Chapter 10 is all about that. But it's also a great chapter to show us a great use of the Old Testament. I don't know if you've ever heard someone say this, I certainly have, that we shouldn't use the Old Testament. Preach from the New Testament, that's it. That's what we should do. The Old Testament is not for us. We're not Jews. We're not, under that law anymore. So we shouldn't even have it, and we certainly shouldn't be wasting our time preaching from it and studying it. Well, the Old Testament, certainly we're not Jews and we're not under that law. But that does not mean that we shouldn't use the Old Testament. The Old Testament, Paul told the Romans, is there for our learning. Romans 15, verse 4. Whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning. We can take the Old Testament and use it in the right way and learn a great deal of lessons from it. Paul's going to take the Old Testament here in 1 Corinthians 10, particularly the 40 years that the Israelites were in the wilderness, and he's going to fashion that into a great lesson for them of why they need to stay faithful. The Israelites that came out of Egypt, had they made it to the promised land the moment they crossed the Red Sea? No. Had they already obtained the promise that God had made to Abraham at that point? No. There was the wandering in the wilderness that they had to endure and survive, and most of them, at least those who came out of Egypt, didn't make it. And they didn't make it because they had gone back to Egypt in their heart. They had fallen into apostasy. And so Paul's going to connect that to them. We're in the wilderness now. We're wandering in that wilderness right now. We haven't made it to the promised land. We haven't crossed over into that land that's promised. It's there for all that remain faithful. But we can go back to Egypt in our hearts. We can go back into sin. We can go back into that life. And just as it was their choice to do that, it's ours as well. So Paul's he uses that verse 27 there of chapter 9 as a bridge to bridge this gap into the next section here in chapter 10. Let's notice here verses 1 through 3, and then as we do, we'll make our comments. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud. They all passed through the sea, and they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and they all ate the same spiritual food. Okay? We have here, Paul is pointing their attention to, again, the Old Testament. I do not want you to be ignorant. I don't want you to be unaware. Paul wants them to remember certain things. Perhaps Paul is, certainly is talking to those Jews that were here in Corinth that would have understood exactly what he was talking about, but he also is teaching or telling those Gentiles as well, because in a certain extent they're from that same family in a way of speaking. But he says, I don't want you to be ignorant about our fathers who were all under the cloud. What cloud was that? Well, that was the cloud that guided them during the day when they were wandering, and then the fire, the pillar of fire that was there at night. When it moved, they moved. When it stopped, they stopped. And so they were, in a sense, under it. It was above them, and they were underneath it. So I want you to not be unaware or ignorant about our fathers who were under the cloud. And notice it says they all passed through the sea. There are a number of baptisms in the Bible. When someone talks about baptism, we need to understand what they're talking about. One can be baptized under John's baptism, which was a baptism of repentance. One can be baptized with the Holy Spirit, like the apostles were, like Paul was. One can be baptized for the remission of sins. That's the one that Jesus brought and taught, and the one that we have today. Paul said in Ephesians 4, there is one baptism, but that's still in effect. Here we read about the baptism of Moses. Now, how is it that they were baptized in Moses? How is that? Did we see them all go to the Red Sea, and Moses actually takes all the upwards of 3 million people and immerses all of them in the Red Sea individually? Of course not. Paul's using an Old Testament figure here, an account, and he is lining it up with an illustration that he's trying to make here. So I want you to imagine that you're on the Red Sea. You're in a fishing boat, and you're looking at the land over here that they're escaping from, or to, and Egypt over here. And so you've got the sea in between, and you're looking at a perpendicular angle. And you see the people come to the sea, and then from your vantage point, they go under the sea. You don't see the people anymore. The sea opens this way, and they go and walk on dry land, and then you see them come out on the other side. What does it look like from your vantage point? Well, it looks like they went in the water, and they came out of the water on the other side. They weren't submerged in the sense that there was water all around them. But if we have the cloud above them and the water on both sides, they were, in a sense of speaking, immersed. This is the baptism of Moses. This is the people of Israel that came out of Egypt and are now wandering in the wilderness. This is what it means by the baptism of Moses. This is, they escaped Egypt and came across the sea there. They all passed through the sea. They were baptized unto Moses, because once they came out of that, now they have a new law. And that's where they get to Sinai, and they received this new law. They weren't under that law in Egypt. They didn't know about, there was no Sabbath day at that time. There was no feast days or anything like that. There was no temple and worshiping of that sense. They were still in the patriarchal system at that point. But now that they were baptized into Moses, there was a new lawbringer. There was a new baptism. There was a new law. And he eventually is going to say, now there's a new one. There's a new baptism. There's a new lawgiver, Jesus. There's a new law, the New Testament. And so but he's got to make this connection from the beginning. So I don't want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our fathers who were all under the cloud. They passed through the sea. They were baptized unto Moses, and they all ate the same spiritual food. That spiritual food that they received, the manna and the quail, that was given from heaven. They came out of their tents, and there was this white stuff on the ground, and they said, what is it? Manna. What is this stuff? That was the food that came from heaven. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. I am that bread that came from heaven. So again, we have this illustration. They were baptized unto Moses. We're baptized unto Jesus. They ate the spiritual food that God gave them from heaven. We eat the spiritual food that he gave us from heaven. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. We ingest his teachings. We live them out and are sustained by that. Paul wants them to understand so that they do not give offense to people in the world. He wants them to understand what they are doing, what they've been doing, and what they continue to do. We need to take care of ourselves as well. If we truly love people, the way that Paul loved the Corinthians here, he wants them to understand, and we should want people to understand as well. We shouldn't seek to offend anyone. And I'm using offend or offense here in the biblical sense, meaning someone sees how we live and causes them to lose his way because of our actions. People in the world today use the word offend to mean, you make me feel bad or hurt my feelings or something. This is the biblical sense. Paul wanted them to understand so that they would not be offended. They would not go astray. Because again, we can lose our salvation. And so he wants them to understand some things having to do with the Old Testament here. Now, when they crossed the sea, again, as I've already said here with our illustration, you had the sea on the right and on the left. They were guided by this pillar of fire. They saw great works and they rejoiced. All of these things the Jews at least would have been very familiar with, and his Gentiles audience would have learned eventually, much like we have. They were rejoiced because they were saved. They came up out of the water. When did they rejoice? That on the other side of the sea, when it closed in and destroyed the army of Pharaoh and Pharaoh himself. At that time, they were, in a manner of speaking, saved. They were no longer slaves from Egypt. Okay, but follow this illustration. It's one you've seen before many times, I'm sure. But they went down into the water. They obeyed the teachings of God. That wasn't the only thing that saved them. Okay, the sea. They had to follow the commands of God before that point to get to the sea. But they were not saved from the slavery in Egypt until they came up out of the water on the other side. And that's when they rejoiced. Exodus 14, Exodus 15 talks about that. There was dancing and other things because they were rejoicing at what had happened for them. When is it that we rejoice? It's when we come up out of the water. When did the eunuch rejoice in Acts 8? When they came to the water? Not yet. When he was reading about that suffering servant in Isaiah? Not yet. When Philip told him, well, you can be baptized. He came up out of the water and then he rejoiced because then he was saved. Permanently saved, guaranteed never to lose his salvation? No. He rejoiced the same way that the Israelites had. They were saved from Egypt, but they hadn't yet made it to the promised land. So there was rejoicing that was there. That same spiritual food we've already talked about. That's the manna from heaven, Exodus 16. What were they going to eat in that wilderness? Many of them wanted to go back to Egypt simply because of the food. We remember the onions and the leeks and the melons. Well, God gave them food that they were there in the wilderness. What do we eat in the wilderness that we are in today? Well, that's the spiritual food that we eat, the Word of God that He gives us. And so we have all of this illustration that Paul is laying out. And to those who would say we can't use the Old Testament, we don't need it, don't preach from it, don't study it, tell me what he means in 1 Corinthians 10 and without using the Old Testament. Just imagine you don't have it. What does he mean in this section? We would have no idea. You could not study the book of Hebrews from verse 1 without the Old Testament. We need it. We need to understand why we have it, use it appropriately. We're not under that law. I shouldn't go there for my spiritual guidance in a way of speaking, but I can use it to learn lessons. That's what Paul wants them to do. Go to the old law and see how God handled his people then. It's the same way he wants to handle them today. They were baptized into Moses, and on the list goes. So we'll make some other connections here with Israel of old as he's going to do, but anything verses 1 through 3. He's setting them up here, continuing to do so in verse 4, but anything through verse 3. Okay, let's look at verse 4 here. And they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Paul tells them that Jesus was with them at that time. Jesus was with them. He was the one that Moses met there on Mount Sinai that was there when he received the tablets of stone. Jesus was the one who was with them there in that wilderness while they were wandering. What was the spiritual drink that they drank in the wilderness? Remember, they were murmuring again. God's brought us out here to die. We have nothing to drink. What did God tell Moses to do? I want you to take your staff and I want you to strike that rock. And when you do, water is going to come out. They drank all of them to their fill because he struck that rock. That was supposed to be an illustration that Paul was going to use here, and it was going to be perfect. Notice that a lot of things that happen in the Old Testament we see repeated, or we see a lesson about them in the New Testament. There was a reason why God told Moses to strike that rock. But remember what Moses did later. God told him, I don't want you to strike it, I want you to speak to it this time. Just talk to it, and water's going to come out. And Moses, because of his anger, he struck it a second time. Now, and he actually said, must we fetch you water? Kind of indicating that he thought he was doing it. So he strikes it the second time, and God allows water to come out of that rock again because he's not going to destroy his people for the actions of one man. But they all drank that second time. And now Moses isn't allowed into the promised land. And we think, that's terrible. That is too strict. God's being too severe here with Moses. Think of all the things that the Israelites did, and yet many of them were allowed to go in. Why is it that one mistake by Moses keeps him out of the promised land? Well, look what he does, though. Because it's not just losing his temper and striking a rock. God had a picture in mind. This rock is Jesus. And he was struck one time, to put it very, very mildly. He was put on that cross once. And because of that, life-giving water flows out both back to the Israelites of old and forward to us and everybody in between. And then when we need that water again, he doesn't need to be crucified a second time because we continue to sin and make mistakes. Once we obey the gospel, simply speaking and asking for forgiveness gives us again that life-giving water. But Moses violated the type because he struck the rock that second time instead of speaking to it. And so he did far more than just hitting something out of anger, momentary lapse. God was going to use this illustration during Paul's time. And now he has to have it with a little asterisk beside it. This is what was supposed to happen, but Moses messed it up. Moses violated the type here. He paid the penalty here for this violation. Now, the people were baptized into Moses, so to speak. They ate spiritual food, and they drank spiritual water. The connection here is that we all are like that as well. We've been baptized, not unto Moses, but unto Jesus, for the remission of sins. They were led by cloud and by fire. We're led by the light of his word. We rejoice after we've obeyed the gospel. They rejoiced after they left slavery in Egypt, as we rejoice escaping slavery of sin. They ate spiritual food. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. They drank spiritual water, physical water, which came out of a stone. We drink the water of life. Jesus told that woman at the well, if you had the water that I would give you, you'd never thirst again. She said, well, I need that water. Jesus wasn't talking about literal water, but rather his word. And so all of these here are a connection lining up this illustration that Paul's making. They all were saved from Egypt, and yet, because of idolatry in their hearts, because of wanting to go back into Egypt, into slavery, many of them did not make it to the promised land. His point is going to be, we can do that as well. We can go back to Egypt in our hearts. We can mess up to the point where we don't make it if we fall into the same traps that they did, mainly idolatry. And if you don't think we have a problem with that today, you're not paying attention, or you don't know what idolatry means. And so all of these things, he's setting up this illustration to line it up. If we don't have the Old Testament, we don't know what any of these things mean. So we need it. We know what happened to Israel, and the same thing can happen to us. It happened to them in a physical way, which was bad enough, but it can happen to us in a spiritual way, which is far worse if we're not careful. Anything there, verse 4. Okay, verse 5. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for their dead bodies spread out in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they indeed craved them. King James, I think, uses the word lusted after them. Nevertheless, again, what's he talked about for 4 verses? This is verses 5 and 6. For 4 verses, he said that the people of God, the Israelites, were baptized. They obeyed God. They rejoiced because they were saved. They ate spiritual food. They drank spiritual water. They were God's people. Nevertheless, even though they had done all of those things, they had put the blood over the doors, they had walked in dry land, they'd done all these things. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with many of them. How do you know that, Paul? Well, he says at the time, after those 40 years, the wilderness was littered with dead Israelites that had not obeyed God the rest of the way. Sure, they rejoiced because they were saved, but they did not put that into their endurance of the wilderness. We have hopefully reached a point where we can rejoice because we're saved. But just like Israel, we cannot sit back and think we've made it. There's a wilderness to wander through we call life. And we have to get to the other side. We have to get to that Jordan River. They weren't wandering in the sense that they were lost. They were following God. And as long as they remained faithful to him, Caleb, Joshua, the Levites, some of those who were faithful, they remained. But when they went back in their hearts, when they fell because of idolatry, when they craved evil things, the things that were contrary to God's word, that's when they fell. Their bodies were littered along the way. Our spiritual bodies, hopefully, we're going to make it to the end. But at that day, many will be able to look back and see spiritual bodies, in a sense, littered throughout life. There's where I lost my way. This is the point where I went back to Egypt in my heart. This is the point where I became unfaithful. They could do that with literal bodies. We could do it with spiritual selves. Hopefully we won't be able to say that. These here in the Old Testament, they lusted after, they craved evil things. He says there in verse 6, these things were done for our example. Why are we told about those things that happened to Israel? Because it's for our example. The word there is tupoi. My Greek pronunciation's terrible. But the word there is where we get the word type from. It's a type. It's a shadow. It wasn't the real thing. God wanted that picture there, though it was dim. He wanted it for what was coming later, the law of Jesus, and the illustration that it can be for us, the type, the shadows that we see. Many of those things that Israel had, the temple, the tabernacle, the law, many of those things were just shadows of what was to come. And so he's giving them the reasons for those things. Their bodies littered the ground, all of those who lost their way and chose to go back. Numbers 11, verse 4, verse 34, we read about the graves of lust, those that died from the fiery serpents and those who died because the ground opened up and swallowed them because they were trying to take over Moses' position. All of these died because they lusted after worldly things. It's amazing to me in a certain way that the people wanted what they had in Egypt. They didn't remember the chains and the sweat and the whip, but they remembered the onions and the leeks and the melons and the relative safety. But you know, we do the same thing in sin. What we remember the good times. We don't remember what sin did to us. We just remember that we got to choose our own way, or the ease of things that we have. The cares of this world can choke out spirituality like those thorns did with that seed in Matthew 13 and also Luke chapter 8. And so in that same way, Paul wants them to avoid idolatry, avoid worldly lust, so that we can make it as well. Because we can lose our salvation in the way that they lost their lives. But we can also obtain that promised land by doing what they did, which is being faithful all the way through. So we're going to continue with chapter 10, but we're going to stop right there. Anything else, verses 5 and 6, we'll pick up with verse 7 next time we're together. Anybody? All right, thank you so much. Let's stop right there. Pick up verse 7 next time that we're together.